hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 36 powerful words. The Declaration of Independence. In it, we find the vision for a free society, not a society based on race, ethnicity, sect, or class, but a free society based on the natural rights of the individual. The words are familiar to most of us. The principles expressed in the Declaration have decisively shaped our political life since independence in 1776. So much so that perhaps we take them for granted. Take liberty, for example. It's one of the central ideas enunciated in the Declaration, and we use words like liberty or freedom often in our daily lives. But liberty is a word with a very long history. It's used by the thinkers and statesmen of classical antiquity, by students of British common law, and by the American founders. Not least among them, Thomas Jefferson, the chief author of the Declaration. But where did these ideas come from? What do they really mean? And what did they mean to the founding generation? What debates led them to arrive at a new conception of liberty? And what do these ideas mean today? In the next few minutes, we're going to take a closer look at what's behind the language used in the Declaration, and more specifically, what liberty really means. We asked 4 of the nation's leading scholars of American political thought to share their insights on the founding generation and the central ideas expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Here's what they had to say about the concept of liberty as a principle derived from nature, a natural right to liberty.
Liberty is the most essential quality of human beings in society. That's why government exists, to protect our natural right to liberty. This is something that we want foremost in political life. This is the reason why we come into political life. This is the reason why we form societies of men, all for the protection of liberty. And what does it mean to say it's natural? It's a natural right. It's the thing without which people would never consent to be inside of a society. They only consent if they have this natural right to liberty, or as was later put it, who actually consents to be a slave? You may have to do it, you may have no choice, but you would never consent, so it's not a natural condition, slavery. Liberty is your natural condition, the condition you would want if you could choose.
Ultimately, the understanding of liberty there is inseparable from an understanding of human equality. Now, Jefferson is embodying a new wave of thinking that says, to quote a famous statement that he himself quotes, some men are not born with saddles on their backs, and others born with spurs to ride them. There are differences, to be sure, between human beings in all the ways that we recognize and accept today, in terms of sports, musical performance, you name it. But in this respect, all men are equal in the enjoyment of their liberty to live their lives, not at the command of others, but as best they can work them out for themselves.
Liberty is the key, and liberty, it seems to me, means the individual's ownership over his own labor, his own life, and his own ideas. This, I think, is the key concept. It lifts the individual high so that the individual is not merely a member of a group. He's not subservient to a group. Each individual has his liberty, his ownership, you could say, finally, of himself. That, I think, is the key concept, and that concept is elevated very high, as I said, because all of government exists to protect that particular form of liberty.
So, from ancient philosophers to modern political thinkers, the idea of liberty has been discussed, described, and debated in various ways. But what distinguishes the modern understanding of liberty from older ways of thinking? And what are the philosophical sources of liberty as referred to in the Declaration?
So the difference between the ancient notion and the modern notion in a way comes down to the question of what we are by nature. Aristotle said by nature man is a political animal. Locke said by nature man is an individual creature. By nature he is not under the power of a king. He's not given rule by God. He's not part of a hive, part of a natural community, but we're fundamentally somewhat social, but even more solitary or individual.
Here's a sharp divide in the very understanding of what it means to be a free person. In the old way of thinking, the law makes you free. Your behavior, your actions in conformity with the law constitute your liberation. Your liberation from ignorance, idolatry, stupidity, criminal impulses, what have you. You follow the law and you become a free person. The modern notion is that you're free to do what you will unless there's a law against it.
The idea of a natural right to liberty is something that modern political philosophers developed, and especially John Locke, who began with the notion of the state of nature, something that Hobbes had developed, but Locke carried it much further and in a way that was much more influential because he gave an inspiring picture of what human beings are naturally directed towards and the kind of liberty that we need in order to thrive and flourish. One of the biggest differences between Lockean thinking and the American founders' thinking and the ancients simply comes down to the question of how much of humanity is capable of successfully living with liberty and making the best use of liberty.
The sources of the claim to a natural right to liberty can be found, I believe, foremost in Enlightenment philosophy, particularly the philosophy of people like John Locke and Sidney. These would be two very important thinkers, and John Locke was widely read in the American colonies at the time. Before the Revolution, except for the Bible, John Locke's second treatise was one of the most widely read books at the time. And also maybe you could say that the idea of liberty inheres also in a Protestant theology, the idea that each individual is somehow a master or decides things for himself. These would be, I think, the great sources of the idea of natural rights.
Joseph Addison wrote a very popular play about Cato, celebrating his heroic last stand against Caesar, and this was performed among other places in the American colonies. George Washington had it performed at Valley Forge in the dark winter of 1778 during the most hopeless seeming time of the Revolutionary War, and it was inspiring to his troops. It was one of the things that helped to hold them together, was this ancient Stoic vision of people being willing to fight and die for freedom, and the notion the thing that matters most is how we live our lives and not what the outcome is. And that was an understanding of freedom that came from the ancient world and that inspired the American founders.
The founders were also very influenced by a stream of thinkers who were themselves influenced by Locke. The French philosopher Montesquieu, who wrote a book published in 1748, not too long before the founders were doing what they were doing, which affirms liberty as the highest goal of a political society, and many of them were very influenced by Montesquieu's treatment. But Montesquieu, this is a controversial claim I'm about to make, Montesquieu, I would argue, was also very influenced by Locke, so I would put him very much in a Lockean tradition, although there are those who would take issue with my claim there.
So a change had occurred in modern political philosophy and in the founders' thinking. But the Declaration not only represents a new understanding of liberty, it also points to the creation of a new political order. What was so novel about this claim? Had others made it before? What sort of a world did the Declaration envision?
In my opinion, there has been no effort prior to the American founding to actually found a society based on rights understood in the way the Declaration expresses them. So that's one of the great innovations of the American founding, that it's the first attempt to consciously ground a political society on a recognition of what we now call the rights of man.
Once the Americans realized that they had passed a point of no return, then it became an important project for them not only to secure their own rights, but to make a statement to the world and to set an example to the world of sticking up for the rights of absolutely everyone. So it was quite important, and there was, I think, complete agreement that we should declare our independence in terms of universal rights in order to start a new movement in the world.
The rights of man becomes the standard of legitimacy against which one can judge all governments at all times. And so the Declaration itself, it presents itself as a justification of legitimate government before all of mankind, and not simply anymore to the British and to the English.
The Declaration of Independence, the events leading up to it, the vast outpouring of paper about the rights and wrongs of all this, are a watershed in world history. Not that the world was paying a special attention at that point, but it's a clear assertion that we're moving into a new age, an age where you could not presume, by virtue of your birth, that you were entitled to or condemned to a particular stratum in society. You weren't destined to be where you were born, among the top or among the bottom. Now, who you were was more significant than who your daddy was. You didn't inherit status, but you were in a field where you could make your own way. Show your stuff.
From the 18th century down to the present day, the doctrine of natural rights has had its critics. Some have gone so far as to say that natural rights are a myth, an inspiring myth perhaps, but a myth nonetheless. Is this a credible claim?
I believe that people who claim that rights are myth actually don't mean it. I believe that when confronted with something like slavery, they would actually back away from the claim that rights are myths, that they would in fact accept the idea that slavery is a violation of rights, especially if it were themselves who were in danger of becoming slaves.
When the idea of natural rights was propounded and put forth at the time of the Declaration, it was put forth as a truth or a science and a way to understand how to create legitimate government. It wasn't understood by them as a myth, it was understood by them as a science. And remember, the idea of forming a government on the basis of nature and nature's God refers to the idea of reason in science. It's a rejection of founding ideas on revelation or anything like that. It was understood by the founders itself as science or truth, not myth.
Some people have argued that natural rights are a myth, and one of the paradoxes that we face today is that the arguments that were made for natural rights by the people who inspired the American founders, Locke in particular, all go back to this notion of the state of nature, and now that really has been, for the most part, rejected. It seems as if human beings, from everything that we know, studying anthropology, studying evolutionary biology, it seems as if human beings really are much more social creatures and have always been social creatures in a sense. And so you can ask the question, well, does that make our understanding of natural universal human rights suspect or even completely false? And I think it doesn't. I think that what Locke was glimpsing and articulating about human nature remains true regardless of how we understand the prehistory of human societies. That he was understanding and articulating fundamental needs that human beings have and fundamental prerequisites for happy living that are independent of the history of how we developed.
Now, of course, later on, people have come and looked at this and have said, well, this was just the way people thought at the time. We no longer think that way. It was just a myth of the period. The only way to answer this criticism is to actually reason your way through the arguments for the Declaration and the arguments for natural rights and see if they have a claim to legitimacy. Merely to dismiss them as myth is a cheap trick. There could be ideas that are true. The only way to determine their truth is to examine their validity. And of course, we no longer do this today. Even people who very much idolize the Declaration of Independence very often don't examine the grounds or basis of the arguments for the Declaration. We'll only be able to establish this document and these ideas as truthful if we examine them in a critical sense.
It's clear that the founders placed enormous emphasis on the importance of liberty, so much so that they were willing to risk everything, including their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Why was liberty so important to them?
Jefferson and the other founders, I think, thought that liberty was one of the most precious and one of the most absolutely essential things for living a good life. And that's because they thought that we were designed by nature and nature's God to live freely. And Jefferson, in one of his very last letters, says that we thrive and we develop when we face challenges for ourselves and when we successfully overcome those challenges. And just as important as getting it right, solving the problem, is being the person who got it right and who worked his way to the solution.
It's essential to a political life. Whether it leads in all cases to the good life, I'm not so sure. You have the pursuit of happiness. It's not sure that you're going to achieve it, but the pursuit of happiness as one part of liberty is key. So to that extent, I think it's essential for a life with dignity. The opposite of liberty is actually slavery, not just chattel slavery such as we found in the United States, but to a person who's under the heel of someone else, who's dealt with all the time in an arbitrary way, who can't stand up and protect himself, who's subject to the dominion of another. That is certainly an undignified life. So that liberty at least is the starting point of the good life, even if it can't guarantee happiness.
The Declaration doesn't prescribe whether it's liberty for something or liberty from something. It's left open in that way. It's as though, well, everybody knows what liberty is. I know it when I feel it. I mean, philosophically, that's not very adequate. But you might say the promise of the Declaration, or the promise of American life as it was understood in those days, as it was imagined in Europe and places like that, was that this was a place where you could be your own man, where you could try to find your own way. There was nobody standing in your way, forbidding you, but also that there wouldn't be someone who would presume to guide you. So that's an open field full of promise and risks. A lot of people are going to do stupid things and fall on their faces. But as we say, it's a free country, ain't it?
Does Jefferson believe that liberty is essential to a good life? Does the Chicago L run above the city? Yes, I think Jefferson believes liberty is essential to a good life for an individual. Liberty is essential to a good life for a society. Liberty is essential to what it is to be a human being. In fact, I think Jefferson understood that the kind of beings we are that one, we are free beings, and two, all of our faculties find expression in and through a society which is basically a free society. So yes, I don't think Jefferson would hesitate even a second in answering that question. Liberty is essential to a good life, yes.
If you're interested in learning more about the history and meaning of liberty, go to jackmillercenter.org and click on the Online Resource Center tab. Thanks for watching.
This has been a Jack Miller Center digital media production. For more information about liberty and what the founders read, go to the Jack Miller Center Resource Center at jackmillercenter.org.